wanting to stop. They want the resignation of President Rodrigo Paz, no less, and he's only been in...
Imagine waking up one morning and the world outside your window has just completely ground to a halt. There's no food coming into your local markets. The gas stations are bone dry. Your local hospitals are literally sounding alarms because they are entirely out of oxygen. And out there on the pavement, the air is thick with tear gas. The sky is just black with smoke from burning tires. And you can hear the sharp, concussive crack of dynamite echoing off the mountainsides. Now, this isn't a scene from some gritty historical documentary. This is a very real, very present crisis happening in May 2026.
Seriously, think about it for a second. If your city is completely surrounded and barricaded, where do you go? How do you survive? The folks living through this aren't in a war zone from decades past. This is modern-day Bolivia. And what we are witnessing right now is an entire nation of people taking to the streets and saying, we have had enough.
All right, let's dive into Section 1. Where is Bolivia? The heart of South America. Before we can really understand the tear gas and the blockades, we need to set the stage and understand ground zero. Bolivia is completely landlocked, right smack in the heart of South America, and it's bordered by heavyweights like Brazil and Argentina. It's also one of the most profoundly indigenous nations on Earth. We're talking about a country home to over 36 recognized indigenous peoples, including the ancient Aymara and Quechua communities. And politically, it's kind of uniquely split. Sucre holds the constitutional title, but the actual day-to-day heartbeat of the government, that is in La Paz.
And speaking of La Paz, we are dealing with a pretty extreme environment here. 3,600. That is the number of meters above sea level where La Paz and the sprawling, working-class, primarily indigenous city of Alto sit. We are talking about the high-altitude Andean highlands here. Now, El Alto has a serious history of shaking the nation when it gets angry. It literally brought down a president back in 2003. And today, in 2026, it is doing it all over again.
Moving on to Section 2. Sparks of a rebellion. The anatomy of an uprising. You know, massive national uprisings like this, they rarely happen overnight. They are a slow burn. Protests were actually already simmering back in January under the new centrist president, Rodrigo Paz, who came into office promising economic reform. Then, in April, his government passes something called Law 1720. That was the match that lit the powder keg. By May 13th, the government was completely backpedaling and repealed the law, but honestly, it was way too late. The momentum was already unstoppable. Just 3 days later, on May 16th, the military was deployed right into the streets.
So what exactly was this trigger? Well, Law 1720 was billed by the government as a financial reform, something to let farmers use their land as collateral for bank loans. Sounds okay on paper, right? But here is what the rural poor actually heard. If you can't pay your debts, the banks are going to come and take your land. In Bolivia, where the colorful Wifla flag symbolizes indigenous sovereignty over territory, land isn't just real estate to be bought and sold. It is identity. So to the farmers, this law felt like a direct existential threat.
Let's put this into a perspective that us American history buffs will totally get. Think back to 1776. American colonists rebelled over a broken relationship with their state, right? Ignored voices, passing the Stamp Act for taxation without representation, and enacting the Proclamation of 1763, which severely restricted Western land settlement. Today in Bolivia, we are seeing some really striking parallels. You have an exhausted populace facing economic collapse, fighting a distant government that passes arbitrary land laws like 1720, all driven by this profound gut-level feeling that the state simply is not listening to its people. Which brings us to Section 3, the deeper grievances, fuel, funds, and frustration.
Look, the land law was the spark, for sure, but the firewood had been piling up there for years. The protests didn't just magically stop when Law 1720 was repealed, because the farmers, the teachers, and the miners had finally found their voice, and man, they had a lot more grievances to air out. We're talking about absolute financial ruin for working-class families here. Rampant fuel shortages are just paralyzing the entire nation. And what little fuel does hit the market, it's often been contaminated. literally destroying the engines of transport trucks. Foreign currency reserves are basically wiped out. Inflation is hovering near 20%. Everyday Bolivians are just standing by, totally helplessly, watching their purchasing power evaporate into thin air. Mario Argolo, who's a leader of the National Workers Union, really captures the mood on the ground perfectly. He's essentially asking, what future awaits our children and grandchildren? It's this profound, deep-seated loss of faith in the Paz administration's ability to fix a broken state.
But then, plot twist. Into this highly volatile fire steps a ghost from the past, former President Evo Morales. Now, Morales is currently evading an arrest warrant for some serious legal charges, which, it's worth noting, he claims are completely politically motivated. But instead of hiding out, he organizes this massive 190-kilometer march, on foot, straight toward La Paz. For a lot of observers, his sudden reappearance really complicated things. It took a grassroots movement for economic justice and turned it into a highly partisan political battlefield, heavily focused on demanding the current president's resignation.
Okay, let's look at Section 4, the situation right now. A nation under siege. 3,500. After some initial attempts at concessions totally failed, that is the sheer number of soldiers and riot police the Paz administration ordered into the streets of El Alto in an early morning operation on May 16th. They moved in with batons and shields to clear out the blockades, but as you might guess, instead of restoring order, sending in the military acted a lot like throwing gasoline on a fire. It absolutely escalated the violence. Fast forward 2 days to May 18th, and it was a full-blown street battle. You had miners using dynamite, literally the tool of their trade, to push back against police right near the presidential palace. Over 120 people were detained in a single day, and at the exact same time, the Bolivian Senate actually voted to overturn previous limits on emergency security measures. Because of this, human rights groups are now terrified that they are clearing a path for outright martial law. 50 million US dollars. That is what business organizations estimate these blockades are draining from Bolivia's economy every single day. In a nation that is already in an economic freefall, that isn't just some spreadsheet error. That is a devastating real-world loss of livelihoods. But let's be real. The true cost here is measured in human lives, not just dollars. Supermarket shelves are completely bare. 5,000 vehicles are just stranded out on the highways. Hospitals are out of oxygen. And tragically, 4 people have already died, mostly because ambulances just couldn't cross the picket lines. It is a heartbreaking, vicious cycle where a nation is essentially talking to itself through tear gas and barricades. The people protesting and the people suffering from the shortages, they are often from the exact same communities.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Paths Forward for Bolivia, Bending or Breaking.
So where on earth do they go from here? Young nations often face these critical moments where they have to choose to either bend through dialogue or break through force. Bolivia is squarely at that crossroads right now, and experts pretty much agree there is only one viable path to survival here. Number 1, we need genuine structured dialogue with independent mediators, not just shallow political theater. Number 2, immediate concrete economic relief to stabilize things like food and fuel. Number 3, absolute accountability. That means releasing peaceful protesters, investigating violent actors on all sides, and not letting political figures hijack the movement for personal immunity. And finally, international support that actually focuses on human rights rather than just cheering on military crackdowns. You know, at the end of the day, the indigenous farmers, the miners, the teachers out there, they are not the enemy of the state. They are the state. A government that responds to legitimate economic hunger and frustration purely with arrests and military force, they aren't really solving the crisis, they are just digging the hole deeper. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Bolivia will survive this. Its people have weathered dictatorships, economic collapses, and wild turbulence before. But the real question is, what kind of Bolivia emerges when the smoke finally clears? Will it be a nation where the voices of the poor and indigenous are finally seated at the table of power? Or will silence and tear gas be the only answer to the cry of the hungry? That answer is literally being written right now, out on the blocked roads of the Andes. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep your eyes on the history happening today.